Imagine pulling a body from the earth that looks almost alive, eyes closed, skin intact, hair still clinging to the scalp.
This is a bog body. It is probably 2,000 years old. This is the best preserved head and face from prehistory.
Fingernails perfectly preserved. Now imagine the body has been dead for 2,500 years. This is the eerie reality of Europe's bog mummies, bodies so perfectly preserved by peat that they seem frozen between life and death.
He was clearly prepared for this moment. He was shaven, he had last meal.
For decades, scientists thought they understood who these people were and why they died. Then DNA testing revealed something nobody expected. So what exactly did those tests show? The haunting discovery of Europe's bog bodies. Scattered across the cold, waterlogged landscapes of northern Europe lie some of the most perfectly preserved human remains ever discovered. Denmark, Ireland, Germany, the Netherlands, and parts of Britain have all yielded these strange corpses, pulled from peat bogs where they've rested undisturbed for millennia. Unlike the dried husks of Egyptian mummies or skeletal remains found in graves, bog bodies look disturbingly lifelike. Their skin, though darkened and leathery, remains flexible. Their facial features are recognizable. Some still have stubble on their chins. The preservation happens because of the unique chemistry of peat bogs. These wetlands are oxygen-deprived environments where organic material decomposes extremely slowly. The water is highly acidic, saturated with sphagnum moss that releases compounds called tannins. These tannins essentially pickle human tissue, tanning the skin like leather while dissolving the bones. The cold temperatures slow bacterial activity to almost nothing. Together, these factors create a natural mummification process so effective that scientists can examine fingerprints, identify stomach contents, and even detect individual hairs on heads that haven't seen sunlight since the Iron Age. What makes these discoveries particularly unsettling is how well facial expressions are preserved. Some bog bodies appear peaceful, as if simply sleeping. Others show traces of their final moments, mouths open in what might have been screams or gasps. The detail is so precise that forensic artists can reconstruct their appearances with shocking accuracy. These aren't abstract ancient people, they're individuals whose humanity jumps across 25 centuries to confront us directly. The bogs themselves were once seen as mysterious, dangerous places. Ancient peoples considered them boundaries between the living world and something else, portals to realms where gods and spirits dwelt. That belief would prove crucial to understanding why these bodies ended up there in the first place. Famous faces from the peat. Among the dozens of bog bodies discovered, a few have become particularly famous, not just for their preservation, but for what they revealed about Iron Age life and death. Tollen Man, found in Denmark in 1950, remains perhaps the most striking example. His face is so perfectly preserved that early photographs show what appears to be a sleeping man, not a 2,000-year-old corpse. A rope made of leather still encircles his neck. His eyes are gently closed, his lips pressed together in an expression that researchers have debated endlessly. Was it peaceful acceptance or the grimace of strangulation? Grobalman, discovered in a Danish bog in 1952, tells a more violent story. His throat was cut from ear to ear, a wound so deep it nearly decapitated him. Despite this brutal injury, his body remained remarkably intact, allowing scientists to study everything from his fingerprints to his last meal. His hands and feet are particularly well preserved, showing the fine details of skin patterns and nails. Ireland has contributed its own famous examples. Old Krogan Man was found in 2003, though only his torso and arms survived. What remained, however, told a fascinating story. His hands were smooth and uncalloused, his fingernails carefully manicured. His arms showed evidence of considerable strength. Most intriguingly, his nipples had been cut, a detail that would later prove significant in understanding ritual practices of Iron Age kingship. Qaunta Man, discovered in the same region around the same time, possessed what might be history's oldest documented hairstyle. His hair was styled upward using a gel made from plant oils and pine resin. Chemical analysis revealed the resin came from southwestern France or Spain, suggesting either extensive trade networks or that this individual had traveled enormous distances before his death. For someone who lived 23 centuries ago, he had remarkably cosmopolitan connections. Each discovery raised more questions than it answered. Who were these people? Why did they die so violently? And why were they placed in bogs rather than given conventional burials? The mystery of violent ritual deaths. The manner of death is what transforms these bog bodies from merely fascinating archaeological finds into something deeply disturbing. These people didn't die naturally, they were killed, often in ways that suggest careful ritual rather than simple execution or murder. Many show evidence of what archaeologists call the triple death, a pattern of overkill that seems designed to ensure death 3 times over. Tolland Man was strangled with a leather noose, but examination revealed he'd also suffered blows to the head before the rope tightened around his neck. Grauballet Man had his throat cut, but also sustained a massive skull fracture. Some bodies show evidence of stabbing, strangulation, and blunt force trauma, all inflicted on the same individual. This redundancy suggests something beyond wanting someone dead. It implies ceremony, symbolism, multiple methods perhaps representing different elements or gods. The positioning of bodies offers additional clues. Many were carefully placed in bogs shortly after death, while rigor mortis was still present or just fading. Some had their eyes and mouths closed, others had objects placed with them or over them. A few were pinned down with wooden stakes or branches, as if someone feared they might rise again. The care taken in deposition contradicts the violence of the deaths themselves. Why would the Iron Age communities engage in such practices? Historical texts from Roman observers provide some context. Ancient Germanic and Celtic peoples reportedly practiced human sacrifice, particularly during times of crisis. Failed harvests, military defeats, or astronomical events might prompt communities to offer their most valuable resource, human life, to appease angry gods. Bogs, viewed as liminal spaces between earth and water, solid ground, and liquid depths, seemed appropriate locations for such offerings. Some researchers suggest these weren't random victims but individuals of high status. The theory proposes that kings who failed their people, whose reigns coincided with disasters, might be ritually killed and consigned to bogs as both punishment and sacred offering. Old Krogan Man's mutilated nipples support this idea. Ancient Irish texts describe a ritual where new kings symbolically nursed from the land by sucking the nipples of previous rulers. Cutting them would render someone unfit for kingship, a symbolic stripping of royal status before death. Other bodies might represent fertility sacrifices, individuals offered to ensure good harvests. The timing of many deaths, determined through analysis of stomach contents and pollen, often corresponds to late winter or early spring, seasons when communities would desperately appeal to gods for the return of growth and warmth. The violence wasn't cruelty for its own sake, but a serious religious practice performed by people who genuinely believed their survival depended on these acts. Why DNA was nearly impossible to extract. For decades, the wealth of information locked inside bog bodies remained frustratingly inaccessible. While the tannins in peat beautifully preserve skin and soft tissue, their murder on DNA. The acidic environment that pickles flesh also breaks down the delicate molecular structures of genetic material. DNA molecules are fragile chains of information easily damaged by heat, light, and especially acids. In the harsh chemical environment of a peat bog, DNA shatters into fragments so small they become essentially unreadable. Traditional DNA extraction methods depend on having relatively intact genetic sequences to work with. Techniques developed for analyzing recent remains or even ancient bones from dry environments simply don't work with bog bodies. The tannins that preserve everything visible destroy everything molecular. Early attempts to extract genetic material from famous specimens like Tolland Man or Grobal Man yielded nothing useful, just degraded fragments too damaged to analyze. Bones, usually the best source of ancient DNA, pose another problem in bog bodies. The same acid that tans skin dissolves calcium. Many bog bodies have bones that are partially or completely demineralized, turned soft and rubbery, or dissolved entirely. What looks like a perfectly preserved body on the outside often contains barely any skeletal structure inside. Without dense bone tissue to protect DNA from environmental damage, genetic material is exposed to destruction. The challenge frustrated researchers for generations. Here were some of the best preserved ancient bodies ever found, offering unprecedented views into Iron Age life, yet their genetic secrets remained locked away. Scientists could study their skin, analyze their last meals, examine every detail of their physical appearance, but couldn't answer fundamental questions about ancestry, relationships, or geographic origins. For a long time, it seemed these questions would remain permanently unanswered. The breakthrough in modern genetic technology. Everything changed with the development of next-generation DNA sequencing technologies. Unlike older methods that required long intact genetic sequences, modern techniques can work with tiny fragments, piecing together genetic information from damaged, degraded samples that previous generations of scientists would have considered worthless. These new approaches don't need pristine DNA. They can extract meaning from molecular wreckage. The key innovation involves targeting specific types of genetic material that survive degradation better than others. Mitochondrial DNA inherited exclusively through the maternal line exists in much higher quantities than nuclear DNA because each cell contains hundreds of mitochondria but only one nucleus. More copies mean better chances that some fragments survive intact enough to analyze. Advanced sequencing can identify and amplify these rare surviving sequences. Hair shafts surprisingly preserve DNA better than most soft tissues. The same structural proteins that make hair durable also protect genetic material trapped inside. Teeth, especially the pulp cavity inside where roots anchor to the jaw, can shield DNA from some environmental damage. Even when bones themselves have been demineralized, microscopic fragments sometimes survive in protected pockets, retaining enough genetic information for analysis. Perhaps most revolutionary is the ability to analyze environmental DNA genetic traces that leach from bodies into surrounding soil and plant matter. Peat itself can trap and preserve molecular signatures. Scientists have successfully extracted human DNA from soil samples taken near bog bodies, genetic material that seeped from decomposing tissues and adhered to peat particles. Even pollen grains found on skin or in stomach contents can carry traces of human DNA. Computational advances matter as much as laboratory techniques. Sophisticated algorithms can now take thousands of tiny damaged DNA fragments and reconstruct original sequences, recognizing patterns and filling gaps based on statistical models of genetic variation. These methods, originally developed for analyzing degraded crime scene evidence and extinct species recovered from permafrost, work equally well on bog bodies. By combining multiple approaches, extracting every possible source of genetic material, and applying computational power that would have seemed like science fiction 20 years ago, researchers finally gained the ability to sequence DNA from these ancient remains. And what they found challenged fundamental assumptions about who these people were. What the last meals revealed. Before genetic breakthroughs provided new insights, stomach contents had already begun telling surprising stories. The preservative qualities of peat bogs extend to what people ate hours before they died. Analyzing these final meals offers a window into not just diet, but also ritual practices and seasonal timing of deaths. Grobelman's stomach contained a porridge made from dozens of different plant seeds, including barley, flax, and various wild grasses. Interestingly, many of these seeds came from plants that wouldn't normally be harvested together or eaten as a primary food. Some were known to be mildly toxic or at least unpalatable. The meal seemed deliberately constructed from symbolic plants rather than nutritious ones. Tolland Man had eaten a similar mixture, with one addition that caught researchers' attention: mistletoe pollen. Mistletoe held deep significance in Celtic and Germanic belief systems associated with fertility, the other world, and ritual practices. Its presence in a last meal strongly suggested ceremonial preparation rather than an ordinary dinner. These weren't people grabbed randomly and killed. They'd been fed specific, symbolically meaningful foods as part of a ritual process leading to their deaths. The absence of meat in most last meals is equally telling. Many bog bodies show evidence of generally high-protein diets during their lifetimes, indicated by isotope analysis of their hair and nails. Yet their final meals were exclusively vegetarian, often dominated by grains and seeds. This shift suggests a period of ritual preparation, possibly fasting from certain foods before sacrifice. The change in diet might have been days or weeks long, gradually preparing the victim for their role in ceremony. Seasonal timing emerges from pollen analysis. The types of pollen found in stomach contents and adhering to skin indicate the time of year plants were flowering. Many bog body deaths cluster around late winter and early spring, the hungriest time of year when stored food dwindled and communities anxiously awaited the return of growth. This timing aligns with fertility rituals, desperate offerings made when survival felt most uncertain. These meals tell us the deaths were anticipated, prepared for, possibly even expected by the victims themselves. These weren't ambushes or executions following crimes. They were religious ceremonies conducted with formality and symbolic attention to detail. Isotopes tell a migration story. While DNA tells us about genetic ancestry, isotope analysis reveals where individuals lived during different periods of their lives. The basic principle is elegant. Different geographic regions have slightly different ratios of chemical isotopes in water, soil, and plants. These regional signatures get incorporated into human tissues as people eat and drink. Teeth, which form during childhood and don't remodel afterward, preserve a record of where someone spent their early years. Bones, which constantly rebuild, show a more recent picture. Hair grows continuously, creating a timeline of movement over months or years before death. When scientists analyzed isotopes from bog body teeth and compared them to the local environment where bodies were found, something unexpected emerged. Many didn't match. The chemical signatures in their teeth indicated childhood spent in different regions, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away from their final resting places. These weren't local people. They'd traveled or been brought from distant territories. Old Krogan man's isotope suggested origins in a different part of Ireland from where he was found. Cloney Cavan man's results indicated a similar pattern of movement. In several Danish bog bodies, tooth isotopes pointed to origins farther north or east, possibly in what's now Sweden or northern Germany. The pattern repeated across multiple individuals from multiple sites. These people move significant distances during their lives. This mobility raises fascinating questions. Were they travelers by choice, traders who moved between communities, or were they captives taken in raids or conflicts and brought to new territories? Their high-status markers, the carefully maintained nails and sophisticated hairstyles, argue against them being simple prisoners. Perhaps they were diplomats, ritual specialists who traveled between communities, or members of elite families engaged in political alliances that required geographic mobility. The isotope evidence also challenges the notion of isolated tribal territories. Iron Age Europe appears to have been more connected than once assumed, with individuals routinely crossing what we might think of as cultural boundaries. The bog bodies weren't just locals who happened to end up as sacrifices. They were people whose lives involved movement across landscapes, suggesting networks of exchange and interaction that stretched across the continent. This context makes their deaths even more intriguing. Why would outsiders become ritual sacrifices? Were they specifically brought to certain bogs because of those locations' sacred significance? Did their foreign origins make them more valuable as offerings, representatives of distant peoples and lands given to local gods? The DNA results that changed everything. Modern genetic analysis finally revealed what isotope studies had hinted at. The bog bodies weren't simple representatives of local populations. Their DNA showed ancestry patterns that were unexpected, complicated, and in some cases quite surprising. While specific results vary by individual and site, several broad patterns emerged that fundamentally changed how archaeologists understand these remains. First, genetic analysis revealed that multiple bog bodies showed ancestry components from regions far beyond where they were buried. Some Danish specimens carried genetic markers more common in populations from southern or eastern Europe. Irish bog bodies sometimes showed Scandinavian ancestry components. These weren't just people who traveled during their lifetimes. They carried genetic heritage from distant populations, suggesting their parents or grandparents came from elsewhere, or they themselves were members of mobile populations with roots in multiple regions. Second, researchers found unexpected genetic relationships between geographically separated individuals. Several bog bodies from different sites discovered hundreds of kilometers apart showed signs of shared ancestry, suggesting they belonged to extended family networks that spanned vast territories. This finding supports theories about elite lineages with pan-regional influence, families whose power and prestige transcended local tribal boundaries. Third, the genetic analysis often contradicted simple assumptions about local populations. The people buried in bogs weren't always genetically similar to communities farming the surrounding landscape. In some cases, they represented minority populations genetically distinct from the majority. This distinction adds credibility to theories that they were outsiders, possibly captives or perhaps ritual specialists who came from elsewhere specifically to serve religious functions. The DNA evidence also provided insights into health and physical characteristics. Some individuals carried genetic markers for traits like red hair or light eyes, helping reconstruct their living appearance. Others showed genetic susceptibility to certain conditions, though whether these played any role in their selection for sacrifice remains speculative. A few showed signs of parasitic infections or nutritional deficiencies detectable at the genetic level, hinting at health challenges before death. Perhaps most significantly, the genetic evidence suggested these weren't random individuals. They were carefully selected, often from among populations that were already somewhat unusual or distinctive. Whether that distinction came from foreign ancestry, unusual genetic traits, or membership in specific family lineages, these people were marked as different before they were marked for death. Elite status or sacrificial victims. The physical evidence presents a puzzle. Many bog bodies show clear markers of high social status, smooth, uncalloused hands indicating lives free from manual labor, carefully manicured fingernails, well-nourished bodies, elaborate grooming. Yet they died violently and were disposed of in bogs rather than given the formal burials accorded to elite members of Iron Age societies. How do we reconcile these contradictions? Old Krogan Man exemplifies this paradox. His hands showed no signs of heavy work. His arms were strong but not from farming or smithing. His final meal included significant amounts of protein, luxury foods not available to common people. Especially in late winter when he died, someone had clearly maintained his nails, keeping them clean and trimmed. This was a person of status, possibly even a king or chieftain. Yet he died violently, his body mutilated and dumped in a bog. Clonikavan Man's elaborate hairstyle constructed using imported resin that required connections to Mediterranean trade networks tells a similar story. Creating and maintaining such a hairstyle demanded time, resources, and materials that common farmers wouldn't have possessed. The style itself suggests someone concerned with appearance, possibly for ceremonial or political reasons. This wasn't a peasant grabbed randomly from fields. Several theories attempt to explain this paradox. The most compelling suggests that high status might have been a requirement, not a contradiction, for certain types of sacrifice. If the goal was appeasing gods during crises, offering someone of low value might be worse than offering nothing. The sacrifice needed to hurt, to represent genuine loss to the community. Giving up a king, a priest, or a noble demonstrated serious commitment to the gods. Ancient Irish mythology supports this interpretation. Kings were believed to hold sacred responsibility for their land's fertility and prosperity. A king during whose reign crops failed or enemies triumphed had broken this sacred contract. Ritual killing of such a king, followed by deposition in a bog boundary between worlds, might have been seen as necessary to restore cosmic balance. The violence inflicted on their bodies prevented them from remaining as honored ancestors, transforming them instead into offerings that carried community guilt and desperation to the gods. Another possibility involves sacred kingship cycles. Some cultures practiced fixed-term kingship, where rulers served for predetermined periods before being sacrificed and replaced. This ensured the vitality of the land by preventing the accumulation of spiritual pollution that might cling to long-reigning monarchs. If some Iron Age societies followed similar practices, it would explain why high-status individuals ended up as bog sacrifices. The evidence doesn't point to a single answer. Different bog bodies probably represent different circumstances, different local traditions, different specific reasons for death. What unites them is the combination of apparent status during life and ritual death after, suggesting these weren't criminal executions, but something more complex and religiously significant. Pan-European ritual networks. One of the most fascinating implications of the new DNA and isotope evidence involves rethinking the social and religious geography of Iron Age Europe. Instead of isolated tribes performing local rituals with local victims, the evidence suggests something more complex: shared sacred sites that drew people from multiple regions, creating networks of ritual practice that spanned hundreds of kilometers. Certain bogs appear to have held significance beyond their immediate areas. The concentration of bog bodies at specific sites, combined with evidence that many victims traveled from elsewhere, suggests these weren't just convenient disposal locations. They were pilgrimage destinations, places of acknowledged sacred power where communities from wide areas might gather for important ceremonies. The deaths conducted there weren't private tribal affairs, but potentially large-scale ritual events involving multiple groups. This interpretation helps explain the foreign ancestry patterns showing up in DNA analysis. If certain bogs served as regional or even pan-European ceremonial centers, victims might have been brought from considerable distances, specifically because of those locations' religious importance. The journey itself might have been part of the ritual, a procession ending in sacrifice at a site recognized across cultural boundaries as particularly powerful or appropriate for such offerings. The sophistication of some bog bodies, their imported goods and cosmopolitan connections makes more sense in this context. These might have been individuals whose lives involved traveling between communities, possibly serving as religious specialists, diplomats, or political hostages. Their international character wouldn't have been incidental to their sacrifice, but central to it, making them appropriate offerings at sites that transcended local identity. Archaeological evidence supports the idea of shared ritual practices across Iron Age Europe. Similar deities appear under different names in Celtic, Germanic, and other traditions. Ritual practices show common patterns despite linguistic and cultural differences. Trade goods moved across vast distances, implying communication networks sophisticated enough to share not just objects, but ideas and beliefs. Against this backdrop, the concept of certain locations holding pan-regional sacred significance becomes entirely plausible. This perspective transforms how we understand Iron Age society. Rather than a fragmented landscape of isolated, mutually hostile tribes, we're seeing evidence of interconnected communities who, despite their differences, shared enough common religious framework to recognize the same sacred sites and participate in similar ritual practices. The bog bodies weren't just local mysteries, they were participants in a wider spiritual geography that connected communities across the continent. The DNA evidence has given us more than genetic sequences. It's revealed a world more connected, more complex, and more culturally sophisticated than previous generations imagined. The bog mummies weren't simply unfortunate victims of primitive brutality. They were part of elaborate ritual systems that spanned distances and bridged cultures, their deaths carrying meaning that extended far beyond the edges of the bogs that preserved them. 25 centuries later, as we finally unlock their genetic secrets, we're discovering that these preserved faces staring up from the peat belonged to people whose world was wider and whose deaths were more significant than anyone suspected. They weren't just locals who died badly, they were travelers, possibly even willing participants in religious dramas that connected communities across ancient Europe. The bogs didn't just preserve their bodies, they preserved evidence of a shared Iron Age world we're only now beginning to understand.